and welcome to another episode of our crossover event of Lizzie Watches Yaoi and of me and Gaia's podcast Beneath Your Skin, where we talk about horror movies, particularly those that feature demonic possessions, and I, my Yaoi thing, talk about animes that have beautiful boys that love each other. So why not talk about an anime about beautiful boys who love each other that are also priests fighting demons? And that's where we get this lovely Vatican miracle examiners.
So lovely and so full of beautiful boys, only waiting to be analyzed and talked about.
Yes. Oh, it's lovely. And this episode has a lot to talk about because it's got quite the history to it. But we'll start off, and our episode opens with someone clearly going a bit nuts and screaming at the darkness. And then it turns out that he is an artist and he is painting, and he is now screaming at the painting. And he's like, no, it's going to happen again. And we find out this man is called John. And he looks quite emaciated. He's very skinny. His hair and beard are completely like wild and untamed. And he's clearly going through a lot. And John is also having visions of the future, and he's being able to predict certain events. And one of the visions he's seeing, he's done this big painting of this volcano. Now, the stuff that I had to get my head around for this is they keep saying that it's set in somewhere called Jairobi. And it turns out Jairobi is the Japanese pronunciation for Nairobi. So they are in Nairobi, and about 60 kilometers north of Nairobi is Mount Longonot, where the volcano is. So, because I was like, really? Is there going to be. Oh, no, no, wait a minute. These are actual places. Like, so while some of it I thought was a bit random, so this is really hard to find out stuff. Some of it actually is based on an actual landmarks. Whether or not this, like, I don't think this volcano has actually like exploded and taken them all out, but it's predicted that one day it might. But yeah, he's having these great revelations, and he's clearly really like stressed out by his visions and the fact that he is seeing things and he's predicting the future. Then into the room enters this beautiful, angelic looking priest who calls his name ever so softly. And then we cut to the credits. And we get our awesome song, which is amazing. And we also see that the credits have changed slightly in the fact that all the still images that were from the first arc have now been replaced with images of the characters we're going to meet in this arc. And our new episode is called God Bestows on Us All His Revelations. Now, I don't know if that is a quote from the Bible or not, or just a.
Not sure. I would say no, but it does imply something. Sometimes God gifts vision of the future to some most beloved people among all others. Sometimes what is intended as a gift is a curse, because human minds is not made to actually know the future. And sometimes when you are tasked with such an important thing, you lose your mind. That's why in the past, many prophets were called witches, called the devil's worshippers, because God is not the only one who can gives you visions of the future. Many of them were born as witches or demons worshippers, but a few of them they were called saints. What was the difference? Probably just because they were lucky enough to already have taken the vows and already been priests when that gift was given to them, or they were part of noble families and then harder to kill for obvious reasons. But yes, since the beginning of this episode, we have to wonder if this man is really a saint, gift with the gift of prophecies, or is a sinner cursed by the devil himself with visions of the future.
Yes. So the title sets up what is going to be happening and kind of the theme of this episode, and it's going to be about visions and sainthood. So we cut to our first scene, and Roberto is researching away, looking at ancient things, and telling us a little bit more about kind of like his ethics and his research practices, and being well aware that while these ancient texts are amazing to research, you can get obsessed in this world of looking into it. And sometimes obsession, like, breeds sin because you are no longer revering, especially for him who's a priest, revering God, you are revering knowledge. And there is a thin line between finding knowledge and worshipping knowledge. And as someone of faith, you should not put all your faith in knowledge because too much knowledge can also corrupt a person and cause them to sin for the sake of collecting more knowledge.
And we have to remember that during the Middle Age, many so called forbidden books were kept in the monasteries' libraries and locked away from everyone else, not just because many people couldn't read, but because the ones who could read could be corrupted by knowledge. So monasteries in the past, they were, yes, a place where culture was kept and revered, and many beautiful books arrived to us only thanks to the works of those monks, but also many books were lost for the same reason, because they were deemed forbidden, they were deemed too powerful, too corrupting, and they were destroyed
Yeah.
because of that. So monasteries in the past, they both were the keepers of knowledge, but also the destroyers of that kind of knowledge that was deemed to be dangerous.
Yes, which makes a lot of sense because obviously they say knowledge is power and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So, as a man of God and a man of faith, but also a researcher, he is aware that in ancient times so many texts were seen as corruptible and the root of sins, it's because that knowledge can corrupt someone and he's got to like walk that thin line. But he and Joseph are called in to find out their new case, and their new case is something of about an incorrupt corpse, an incorrupt corpse, which basically is somehow divine intervention has stopped the corpse from decomposing. So they've got to work out if this is a true miracle, like because Jordan has passed away, but his corpse is not decomposing and it's still saying pristine and perfect, and therefore they must go in and investigate. And much like the previous case, there is layers and layers and hidden secrets and truths because not only is this corpse not decomposing like it should, it's the corpse of a man that was revered as a prophet and first started off with telling prophecies that came true and eventually led the people and the locals to believe that he was a saint. So they've also got to investigate whether or not he truly is a saint. So we then cut, after all this like heavy information, to dinner time. And the whole like, oh, look at them being so domestic. And the kid and Roberto's like, oh, we might not get a meal like this for a while, so I thought I'd cook you something wonderful. So we get a bit of cute domestic fluff of our boys eating dinner, getting ready for their journey, before it is time for them to fly to Africa to visit Nairobi, which is in fact Nairobi. So they're going to Nairobi to investigate this potential miracle. And they also start discussing more about John and the fact that he was revered. And the reason that he started having visions is because he took a look at something called the Akashi scripture, Akashi words, which is from Hindu mythology and is a translation of ether or atmosphere. I actually did my research for this episode because while I am not know any of the religious stuff, like culture, now that this is my bag, and I've got to admit African culture is not my wheelhouse. I'm much better with my Asian culture. But what I found quite interesting from this episode is obviously there's a lot of reference to a snake god, and the snake gods, when you think of snake gods you think of the Naga and you think more Indian and Thai, and you think of Sukhothai and Hinduism. But it turns out that Nairobi has actually got a very large population of Hindus and Sikhs, as well as, so there was something about the colonization of Nairobi meant that there's a large, Christianity is the first religion. Then after Christianity, it's Buddhism, Hinduism, and Sikhism, which is why there's that kind of like mixed cultural bag and like a bit more of this kind of like more snake mythology and snake based like gods, and talk of like how a priest living, well, a man living in Africa would get a hold of a Hindu text that opened his mind and became basically a prophet. Right, so they fly to Africa, which seems fine, apart from that Joseph is very excitable about this obviously non-decomposing corpse and starts talking about ways to keep it alive, like stuffing it with salt and caspian and draining it all of blood and removing. And Roberto's like, "We're about to eat. Maybe talk about this later. Maybe I don't need to know how he drained the blood and stuff a corpse over dinner." And to travel to the place, they have to go by boat, and it turns out that our poor Joseph is seasick. He's not very good at that, so kind-hearted Roberto is like, "Oh, you're feeling poorly. Let me carry your bags for you." And I'm like, "Oh, Roberto really is the perfect man. He cooks, he cleans, he, like, you know, he house, he's intelligent, and he also carries your bags when you're feeling poorly." And you're just like, "Oh, no wonder Joseph is so besotted with him." But on their way to go to where they're heading, they come across a Bazuna ceremony, and Bazuna is a derivative of it's the kingdom of Bazin, I believe. As I say, my African history and knowledge is not perfect. I had to look up some of this, but basically, it's one of the when the area was in war and being settled and stuff, and they kind of like one of the major kingdoms collapsed and they all splintered off into this separate, and this is like one of these separate kind of tribes and religions that grew up in the area, one of the traditionals, and they come across the scene, and at first they're like, "Oh, it's a demonic ritual," and it's like, no, this is like an actual like historical like ritual, but there does appear to be this horrific corpse just kind of on the ground that everyone's staring at. We get introduced to FBI Bill. You know, he has a surname, but at the moment I'm calling him FBI Bill. And FBI Bill, who is also a Catholic, has turned out he has come to this area because of multiple disappearance cases. One of them being of a woman called Amy, who is also Catholic, but she came to make a documentary film of the local culture and this local religion. And it's her corpse that we are looking at. And again, her corpse is completely emaciated, like completely so. It's barely a thin layer of skin over just like bones and decomposition, and it's not looking good. So she has obviously either been murdered or killed ritualistically, but something bad has happened. But Joseph, our clever science boy, looks and goes, her pelvis is quite low, which means that she would have been pregnant when she died, but the baby is missing. Yeah, so they're like, okay, this is another layer, because Vatican examiners loves to throw us a mystery within a mystery within a level within a conspiracy, and this is no exception. So after they meet Bill, it's time to actually go to the holy place they're going to, and they end up. I kept calling it Caramel Chapel, but it's not Caramel Chapel. It's Saint Carmel Chapel. I don't know if Saint Carmel is the name of. Fill me in.
It's actually is one of the adjectives that we use to indicate the Holy Virgin. One of the many representation of the Holy Virgin is Santa Maria del Carmelo. So Carmel is just that. So we know the church we are going to see is dedicated to the Holy Virgin. That's
okay. All right. It's absolutely beautiful. What I absolutely love, is the establishing shot of like this like beautiful vision of this white chapel on the hill. But then as you get close to it, it's kind of paved with these stones that make it look like they're not Western kind of architecture. It's like iconography from obviously a more historical and past place leading up to this chapel. And the fact that the sky in this episode is drawn as if it's Van Gogh's swirling stars, like, or his swirling skies. And you just see this continuous, beautiful, subtle swirling motion in the sky as you look at this beautiful, like, building. And it's quite a juxtaposition, because one minute we were looking at this horrified, almost mummified corpse that has also had a stone shoved in its mouth. And Roberto says that in the culture of this area, that means that the person would have had secrets to tell, and they put the stone in her mouth to stop her telling secrets. And so between the juxtaposition of this, and then going to this church, and then walking into this church, and hearing this beautiful, like, lament, this beautiful choir, like, voice of an angel, and you walk in and you see this vision of beauty. My goodness, he's beautiful. And it turns, and it is the beautiful priest that was at the very beginning of the very beginning of the episode. And his beautiful name is Julia Mikhail Borgia.
And of course, we should have learned since the first few episodes to never trust a beautiful church built where it shouldn't be possible to build one like that. And we should have learned not to trust about beautiful, magnificent, angelic young men. But of course we do, because Julia is absolutely stunning. And he is a Borgia. So that means he is a descendant of Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, who also was the father of the very famous and infamous Cesare Borgia. And above all, he was the father of Lucrezia Borgia, one of the most fascinating female figure in history. She was told to be a poisoner, a terrible woman, plotting in the shadow to protect her own family, being Cesare's lover. And many people also whisper they also had a son together. But in truth, Lucrezia was just a very strong willed woman who was beloved by the people who met her. When she finally got free of the influence of her family and she was married to the ruler of Ferrara, Ercole d'Este, and she became the Duchess of Ferrara. Ferrara was hit by the plague, and she didn't do what many nobles would have done at the time. She didn't leave the city. She helped the people sick in the streets. He said she got the plague herself and she was pregnant when it happened, so she has lost her child like that, but she survived the plague and she was back helping people. When her father died, the next pope was Giulio II della Rovere. The Della Rovere family was a sworn enemy of the Borgias. So she was alone. Her father was dead. Her brother was away in France because she married the sister of the French king. So she was alone, basically, only protected by her new family. But in many ways, in many times that had happened, that if a powerful man had an enemy in a woman and she didn't was protected by her own family but by the husband's family, many times they were thrown to the wolves without regrets. This time the d'Este family, they said no, she is the Duchess of Ferrara. The Duke said, she's my wife. I'm not going to throw her away. I'm not going to give her to you. So the Pope did the most terrible thing a Pope could do to a whole city. He threw an interdetto. An interdetto is basically an excommunication of the whole city. So nothing religious could be done in a city during the interdetto. They couldn't bury their dead in holy ground. They couldn't have mass. They couldn't have weddings. They couldn't have anything religious. And back then, religion was a huge part of social life. So the Pope expected for Ferrara to give him Lucrezia, but it didn't happen. So at the end, the Pope had to take back the interdetto and free Ferrara because it was clear that Lucrezia was so loved by the people that he would have waited all his life for her. That's how powerful Lucrezia's figure really is. And Julia is part of this beautiful and powerful and murderous family. So, yes, we can expect big, big things from him. I'm sure of that.
Yes.
I'm not sure if you are going to see him as a saint or if you are going to find out, like many of his family, he's a murderous, crazy psychopath. But hey, that's,
That's the fun.
yeah, exactly.
And the fact that it doesn't matter because he is beautiful and definitely worth looking at. And it's like, oh, you beautiful, talented person. Well, Julia says that he is singing a lament to a girl that has recently passed away. He also works as a doctor in the clinic that is attached to this chapel, and he couldn't save the life of this girl, so he is singing like a prayer for her so that she can be at peace in the afterlife. She also she he also tells us a little bit more about the chapel and how it was thanks to a foundation that gave it lots of money. And this foundation, the Brun Foundation, was what also found oil in Africa. So there's a lot of money going in, and they seem to have donated it to build this beautiful chapel in the middle of nowhere, basically, because obviously they had to get a boat down a river to get to it. There's no roads, there's no way in. So, remote, isolated area that has obviously a beautiful Catholic chapel and lots of local religion and another god in this lands, and then a shady oil company. But they realise that they have interrupted his prayers, and it's like, we're going to let you continue singing and let you kind of like finish your prayers before we move on. So our beautiful boys go to their room for setup, and again Joseph is completely enamored by Roberto's functionality. He's like, oh, how did you manage to get all of this all ready so quickly? And he's just like, well, we've just got different skills and different needs. It's like, I'm always impressed by the fact that you can talk to Lauren on equal footing. And it's like, oh, he respects his relationship with Lauren. Oh dear, Lauren's going to hate that. The fact that Roberto respects their relationship and thinks it's impressive that they can talk and be equal and help each other. But then they're asked to see Julia again, and Julia wants to bring them to Jordan. So John Jordan, who is being semi-preserved in an area where they're using obviously dry ice to cool the area, but John Jordan is lying there absolutely pristine since his death, not a single iota of decomposition of anything going on, and Joseph is obviously fascinated with this. He's like going up, poking the corpse, and going, "Oh my goodness, look at the temperature! Look at this!" But Roberto's not as animated as normal. And you can tell this because they do it in the anime way of something's wrong with that character, of suddenly you don't see their eyes. There's this shadow from like forehead to nose, and that's always the sign that, oh, the character either doesn't feel well or is having emotions that are clouded at the moment. So while Joseph is excitedly talking about the elasticity of the flesh and the temperature and this, Roberto is like, oh, I don't think I'm feeling well. And Joseph is like, oh my goodness, no! So it's like, it's fine. I'm just going to step outside for some air. You continue, being crazy for the case. So Roberto steps outside and he's sitting.
I just had to point out one thing. It's this very small detail in the whole scene of the Joseph poking at the corpse. He says clearly there is no trace of decay in the air. So he's smelling that there is no smell at all. And that should tell us something, because usually when someone is worshipped like a saint, there is this beautiful, soft scent of flowers coming from the corpse. That's a common thing always said about saints, that there is always these very faint scents of flowers around them. But we don't hear anything about that. So it could be that they didn't know, or it could be that they are trying to tell us, be careful because there is something wrong going on here.
Yes. I mean, considering how the first arc went down, I'm going to definitely assume that something is not quite right here. And whatever this not rightness is, it seems to be affecting Roberto. as he sits down, upset with himself that seeing a corpse has made him feel a bit funny. He's not quite sure why. And then we are introduced to Kid Goldman, which was such an American sounding name, Kid Goldman. But like, it's just that's a very Western name. I'm not sure what nationality he is, but he's called Kid. And he is the man who wrote the book that had all the prophecies of John Jordan in. So he was the one who wrote the prophecies of John. It's like, Kid is just not a normal name. But he comes along and he's like, "Oh, yes, I have some things to tell you." And Roberto's like, "Okay, we'll wait for Joseph and then we'll go and you can tell me what this further information, these further prophecies are." So they go to John's old art studio and we see all the kind of paintings and stuff. And Roberto is not looking good, not looking himself. And Kid tells us about this prophecy that's coming up. First, he tells us about some other prophecies that have come true. Like, he's feeling guilty because he wrote down, he's calling them psalms rather than prophecies. The psalm of a girl who, dies, which was Amy. Then there's one that's like, "Oh, we found that one, but I wasn't able to act on the other one I found." And we find the psalm of the woman that comes from a foreign land. And it's like, so that's the psalm for Amy who's died. And it's like, oh, there's definitely some credibility going on because all these psalms that are being read out have all come true. And then he gives us the kicker. Apparently, 2 people from the Holy Seat are going to turn up. One will be touched by the light, but one will be touched by the darkness and will be taken by the snake god in demonic rite. And you're just like, well, it's not hard to see what's going on here, especially with the beautiful painting of Roberto and the snakes. I'm like, I would hang that painting on my wall because already Joseph has become enamored with Julia. And every time he thinks of Julia, he thinks of his brother and the fact that he's doing all this to try and find answers to prove that miracles can happen so that he can see a miracle happen in the fact that his brother can be cured. And he's obviously medical trained. And then he sees this beautiful, angelic, caring man who also works as a doctor, giving aid to the least fortunate. And he's like, I want to be like this man. I too want to do this. And I too. And that way I could save my brother and it'll be beautiful. And he's a little bit distracted by this. But Roberto's not so much because apparently he is going to be tricked by a demon and ultimately die. Not the best of times. And I'm like, no, not Roberto. But at the same time, yay, Roberto's the centre of the plot. Ooh, darkness. Yeah. So Joseph tells Roberto, don't worry about the prophecy. Don't worry, I will always be there for you. I'm going to protect you because I love you. And it's all like, oh. We're left believing that if this prophecy comes true, Roberto is going to die. And they're not quite sure what to do about this, but it does. But Roberto says that if he dies, it will prove that John is a miracle and a prophet and everything is true and he is a saint. And then Joseph is like, no, I'm not going to believe that because I don't want you to die because I love you. But Joseph does want to hang out with Julia more and help in the clinic. And he's like, I promise you, Roberto, only be in our spare time. Our investigation is the main focus. But he's pulled towards this other character and he keeps thinking about his younger brother. So Joseph goes to help out in the clinic and doing all the good deeds, and they're all having a lovely time healing patients. Seem to be very happy. He also has a moment to email Lauren and cryptically says, I may be paranoid, but could you just send me back that mail that was before? And Lauren's like, oh, you are too paranoid, but yeah, that thing you asked me I will do. And you're like, what thing he asked? What? I want to know what's going on, what's happening. No, back to beautiful times, healing people, having a lovely time. Roberto is having less of a lovely time because he's starting to get short of breath and sweaty and looking very uncomfortable, and he is trying to read and research to try and find what could be going on. And he starts reading out all these psalms, I can't 552, and these verses from the Bible. Now obviously this doesn't mean much to me because I don't know the actual context of these, but each one he reads out seems to be related to a true case of prophecy. So something happened and then it came true. Now, are these all genuine psalms from the Bible?
No.
Okay.
I think the psalm that he's talking about are the psalm John wrote,
Right.
not
Okay.
the ones from the Bible. And I also think there is once again a problem with translation, because at some point we find out that the way Kid and John spoke was in a broken English, but the psalms are written in Italian.
Yeah.
So how is Kid able to read those psalms if he doesn't speak Italian?
Yeah.
That's something that makes me
I
suspicious about the Kid.
Yeah, I think that John Jordan didn't speak Italian. I think he was
Okay,
just
he
writing
only
the prophecies in Italian. So that's why the priest can read it, and he spoke whatever language of the dialect. So basically, but Kid obviously can read Italian, but couldn't speak the
okay,
language that John. That's how I always
okay.
translated that. That's how I took it. But yeah, you're right. The Psalms are the prophecy book rather than actual Psalms from the Bible. It makes it tricky because by calling them Psalms, I'm like, I thought
Yeah,
Psalms only appeared in the Bible. I didn't.
exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. That's the point. I think that's the point. They want so much for us to believe he is a saint. They are going to use only words that are typical of the Bible.
yeah,
And that's another thing that makes me a little bit suspicious, because they are pushing too hard to make
yeah.
us believe that this man is a saint.
Yes. But well, by reading this book of the prophecies of John Jordan, all of a sudden you hear a piercing scream, and you get a little flashback to the tragic life of Roberto. And clearly, his father was also a painter, but was not selling his paint, turned to alcoholism, was domestically abusive to his wife, and things were deteriorating at home with little Roberto, and he was witnessing all of this deterioration. And then you hear, I mean, you're assuming it's his mother just because of what's going on, but the woman is lying on the floor, like going, it's like, and talking to him, and you're like, oh goodness, Roberto, did your mother die? Did your father kill your mother? What is going on? There's a lot going on, and you're just like, oh, Roberto. And Roberto is just seeing this tragicness unfold in front of him, and he's getting more and more upset by it. And then he's also being followed by this shadow, and this shadow is telling him, no matter how far you run, I will always follow you. I am attached to you. I am chained to you. I am with you always. You should turn and look at me. Turn and look at me. And you're like, is this your father? Is there some demon chained to you? Like, what is torturing poor Roberto? It doesn't seem to be going well. And it's just like, oh
I,
no.
I have to admit, I read the whole scene in a totally different way. Probably I've lost something in translation, because I thought that was John Jordan, because we know he arrived at the church with amnesia. So I thought that was John Jordan being a sinner in truth, who was an alcoholic because his paintings didn't sell. He turned against his own wife, and then he has lost his memory of all the bad things he did in life, and he ended up at the church. But it makes a lot more sense if Robert was seeing himself in this family drama.
Yes.
So yeah.
Ah. Oh.
I really read it in a totally different way, but
Yeah, because I just assume that this case has triggered Roberto's own memories of his tragic past and the fact that he cannot escape the shackles of his father.
even because I think the figure, the shadow following Roberto is John Jordan.
Ah.
He looks like John Jordan. So I'm starting to believe something very crazy, but don't mind me and my conspiracy theories. But was John Jordan Roberto's father?
Oh, have to wait and
Because,
see.
because he was so shocked when he saw the corpse. It was like he knew this man. So
Mm.
what the hell is going on there?
Yeah.
I don't no. Oh my
We'll
God.
have to wait, because in true Vatican thing, it likes to throw us just layers and layers and revelations that you never see coming. But
Of course.
whatever is going on, it is certainly upsetting the hell out of Roberto. And then he finally has that moment when he visions a door opening, and it's young Joseph, and I'm assuming it's from their times in boarding school, and that's how they must have met, going like Roberto, reaching out his hand, and Roberto is finally saved from all this misery. And then Joseph's body just disappears into nothing, and then you see the eye of a snake, slithering, and you're like, oh my God, the demons have got you. And just as all that's going on, it cuts back to the lovely time in the church, and you're like, no, snake demons have got Roberto, no. No, we're back in the church, and everything is beautiful and lovely, and they're coming to the end of their day, and they're just chatting, and then Julia falls on the floor, and Joseph is like, "What?" He's like, "No, it's okay. I'm just really tired from like punishing myself earlier." And it turns out that Julia, every time he feels guilt, is self-flagellating himself. And it's like, well, no wonder you're knackered if you've self-flagellated yourself in the morning and then worked in the clinic all day. And I was like, why? And Joseph is all like, I respect the sentiment, but I don't think you have done enough that deserves harming yourself in this way.
And it's a very common practice in the Middle Age church for priests to flagellate themselves to remember and remind the way Jesus was tortured before he was put on the cross. There were people called the flagellers, I think it's the words, people who used to flagellate themselves on the street, walking through the people to rinse their sins with their blood. And it happened during Lent, and they used to flagellate themselves, repeating the Dies Irae. So there is something, but of course, with time, the church deemed this practice unholy. It borders mental illness and masochism and need for pain, for physical pain. So they decided no more, stop these people, no more BDSM practices inside the church, please.
Yeah. Well, Julia definitely didn't get that memo, because obviously he is harming himself. So Joseph is tending to his wounds and, touching little moment. Unfortunately, Roberto is going through a worse moment, because we hear the sound of drums, and we see the snake and the drums, and something is calling to Roberto, and he is following this sound. And deep in a cave, we see masked figures, and there's chanting. There's a many-headed snake god, and they are saying that the sacrifice will be arriving, and all kind of like, oh God, some demonic ritual is going down, and I think it's going to end with Roberto getting sacrificed to a snake god. These are things I do not wish to happen.
And we have a terrible cliffhanger, and you are a monster.
Yes. And then it's made even sadder by my happy sofa time from the end of each episode. So this week's episode, they do the lovely ending of all the, and then there's on the sofa, and Joseph is telling Roberto how perfect his pasta is cooked, and Roberto's going, yes. And he's like, oh, and the way you do this is really nice, yes, yes. And he's like, Roberto, are you okay? Yes, yes. And I'm like, no, Roberto is just not himself. Oh no, my beautiful boy.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. And we have to wait to find out what's going to happen.
Yes.
Monster.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to add to the episode?
Not for now.
Awesome. Well, so for now, I'm just going to say byes. Obviously, if you like Yaoi, check out my Lizzie Watches Yaoi on Pinecast or on YouTube. On Let Zoe Spoil You is my Twitter and my Instagram. You can find links to absolutely everything I do. If you like demonic possession and horror, check out me and Gaia's podcast Beneath Your Skin, again on Pinecast, on YouTube, on Twitter.
Thank you for listening, and bye-bye.
Byes.